Hello, and thank you for joining us today for the TAA webinar, Show Me, the Art of Using Visual Elements to Enhance a Manuscript, presented by Eric Schmieder. Eric is a membership marketing manager for TAA. He has taught computer technology concepts to curriculum, continuing education, and corporate training students since 2001. A lifelong learner, teacher, and textbook author, Eric seeks to use technology in ways that improve results in his daily processes and in the lives of those that he serves. His latest textbook, Web, Database, and Programming, a foundational approach to data-driven application development using HTML, CSS, JavaScript, jQuery, MySQL, and PHP, first edition is available now through Sentia Publishing. Hello, Eric, and thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Becky, and thanks for having me. And thanks to everyone who is joining us for the webinar this morning. Show me the art of using visual elements to enhance a manuscript. So, some visual elements that we typically will see, we're going to discuss ways that we can do it and ways that hopefully we can do it better as we go through the presentation this morning. And we're going to focus specifically on tables and figures, but we're also going to talk about some design tool options today, as well as incorporating some accessibility guideline information for consideration to make the visual elements that you incorporate into textbooks and/or journal articles more effective. So with that, we're going to get started with effective tables and the best practices for presenting data and results in those tables. And the first thing that I want you to think about with regards to table design is that details are important. We have tables to be able to present a lot of details on our study, on our research, on data that backs the information that we're sharing in the narrative of the manuscript in a way that gives people more insight into the information that is at the root of the discussion. So we want to use tables, particularly when there is larger data sets that need to be represented. Maybe you have the full census report that you downloaded from a government site for a particular time period of study in a social services type structure. So, maybe you have a, regular every 60 seconds data is being fed out of a process and manually recorded, and for sake of completeness of study you want to show all of that information in the table. Maybe you have large amounts of information that you just want to summarize. All of these tables become a great way, rather than trying to express all of that information in words and long narratives. So a general rule of thumb would be, if it's going to take more than 2 or 3 sentences to get that data described in a way that it's useful to the manuscript, you might want to consider incorporating it into a table. You might say, well, that's not what I would consider a large data set, but I put the R on the end of larger for that purpose. So something that is a little more than a couple sentences if we tried to describe it. But column and row organization, if that's important, if that's helpful in understanding how information is related, if column headings or row headings can help describe the data, and then instead of coming back and trying to, in words, express, we're now in this region, but we're talking about this particular category of data, then these cross sections, particularly when both rows and columns are using labels to describe the individual cells, a table becomes more effective in communicating that than trying to do so in a narrative form. And as I mentioned a little bit ago, when a sentence or two is just not sufficient for explaining the data, a table can be something that is helpful. So let's consider a table. Let's consider a table that might not be very helpful. If I'm looking at this information, and this information is in a manuscript, I can see, okay, I've got things that look like compass readings, or possibly regional information, or southwest, east, north, south, northeast. But again, I'm interpreting from a perspective of and a frame of reference that maybe I already have established. There's nothing to guide me as to what this information is. And then I've got a series of numbers. And quite honestly, I mean, we've got some long numbers. We've got some decimal values involved there. And this information is presented. It's probably accurate. I'll tell you, I made it up, but it's accurate. We'll assume from the perspective of the research, but without any context. Even if the context is established in the narrative, this table is relatively useless to the end user. So someone receiving, we want to make sure that that information is presented in a way that it makes sense and that it can be quickly digested and used by the person who's reading their textbook, reading their journal article. Same information, okay? All I did was clean this up in terms of some formatting. So, this is identical information, but I have added a header row. So, region, total sales, average product price, percentage increase. Now we have some framework, some structure, some identifying elements to help clarify what those numbers are. And okay, we are talking about, regions, north, northeast, east, south, southwest. And I reordered this. I took the time to move those rows around to say, okay, let's put it in from starting at north at the top of our compass and work our way around clockwise in terms of positioning for the regions. And now someone who's looking for, can easily find that. Now I could have alphabetized it, but generally we think northeast, southwest, or north, south, east, west. So, possibly even putting east at the bottom would have made sense in terms of a sequence. And again, you want to consider your audience, as with any of our writing efforts, to make sure that the information is being presented in a way that they can receive it. At first glance, it may look like I sorted it based off of percentage increase. That just happens with the numbers there, but if you look a little closer, you'll see that, I did base it off of the region, as 5% is less than the 8.91 that shows up in that next row. But I've added dollar signs to indicate that we're talking about money in terms of total sales. I've added comma separators at the thousands and millions marks, and consistently formatted our average product prices with 2 decimal places so that they're clear that we're talking about money. We're talking about dollars and cents in terms of our values that are being reported. And then moving the decimal place and adding the percent sign for the percentage column, to, again, take out any ambiguity that might be there. I'm looking at 0.2908 versus 29.08%. So with this, the table then also has a caption added to it, or specifically a table title. So table 1, sales results by region 2018 with increase over 2017. And I'll be honest with you, I am not a master at APA or MLA format. I pull out my guide based off of what I need through the assignments that I'm working on and such. I'm a computer person, not an English major. So, if your style guide says that table title should be above the table versus below the table, then naturally move that to the position appropriate for where you're submitting and whatever style guide is in use in that particular manuscript. So, here again, just going back a slide, this same data simply cleaned up a little bit with 2 extra things, our table title and our header row, makes a huge difference. One additional thing that's been added here is some shading. So applying a style, the borders, the shading, the lines above and below the header row and at the very bottom, just again gives some definition to here's a heading, here's the body of the data. And then to allow, particularly in larger sets, everything to just simply run together with those numbers. The shading can help separate out the details. So that brings me to my next point about effective tables, and that is that we want to organize and format them consistently. So in organizing those tables, we want to be sure that column and or row headers accurately identify the related content. We should be able to go to the top of a column or to the left of a row and see a point of reference for that bit of information that I'm looking at in a specific cell. The table titles should effectively summarize the table contents. And when I'm talking about percentage increase, my table title gives me an opportunity without having to incorporate that into the header row to identify that that's a percentage increase in sales from 2018 over the previous year of 2017. So use the table title to identify key things about the overall set of information that may amplify your header row or your header column in a way that the information becomes a little more clear to the reader. And then, as I did discuss, related numbers should be consistently formatted with the same precision levels. So if that means adding trailing zeros to your numbers so that you have a precision level of 4 decimal places on every number within a column, so be it. But incorporate that so that we can visually inspect and easily compare numbers side by side. 10.9 versus 109 is hard to distinguish when you're visually scanning down through a list. But if you have 10.9 and you have 109.0 and all of our decimal places line up, particularly if you right align the information in that column, then it makes it very easy to visually inspect the column and compare accurately number to number. Again, if the significance is there and the data supports it, sorting the information in a particular column can also make it easy if you want to find the highest or the lowest. So applying particular sorts and such that are appropriate. Shading is used either across rows or down columns, but not both. Okay, I've seen people try to apply both. Pick what's important. Pick how are people going to read this information and do the comparisons. And in most cases, shading across rows makes best sense. It's there just to kind of keep our visual cue of which line we're on as we're reading and interpreting the data, and everything's going back up to the column headings. But again, in case of maybe census data, we might have categories of information. And I was looking at something from the Department of Education regarding student loans. And this set is basically either active or grace period, and this is in some sort of forbearance or deferment, and then this is in a state of default and other things. And down the left-hand side, they may have it broken down by state or by program area or by Carnegie type in terms of schools and so forth, but that's not as significant as being able to see those groupings of here are active repayments, here are deferred repayments for some reason, and here are payments that are currently seeking collection because they are not being actively paid or in a state of deferment or forbearance. So being able to visually inspect with the shading down those groups and to institute that makes it much easier. So one or the other. Otherwise, everything just looks like a checkerboard and we're trying to figure out where things ended up. Content also can be grouped or sorted logically. So I like to merge column headings, particularly for, let's say, if I have individual columns for each month of the year, January through December, but I've got multiple years represented in a table, then I will generally add an additional header row over the months that is then merged together for 12 cells and identifies that year, 2018, 2017, 2016, so forth, as we go through. If I'm grouping maybe regions and I want to see the individual states, then I'll treat each individual state as a row header and then add an additional merge cell to the left of those individual states to identify the region, and then group things by region, and then alphabetically maybe sort the state names within each of those regions to make the table more effective in understanding how the data relates to the rest of the information presented. Okay, so tables, a lot of things we can do with them, but key is first to make sure that the details are there, that a table is necessary, and that once we have the data presented, that it is in a organized and formatted presentation that makes it easy to read. So figures. Figures, we're basically going to say anything else visual in a manuscript that is not a table, we'll call a figure. So this might be a chart, this might be an image, this might be a diagram, this might be a smart art graphic, this might be a process that is being visually represented. Okay, so in general, there's still going to be some visual representation on the page. So we've heard the saying, a picture speaks 1,000 words. So my question is, what are you saying with the pictures that you're incorporating into your work? So some general rules of thumb with figures or images. Be sure that your images are appropriately chosen. So we don't want to simply say, there's some space on this page and I should probably put something there. Okay, if you are forcing yourself to find something to fit, the white space will be better than anything you choose. I can promise you that. Because particularly in an academic setting, from the journal articles or textbook perspective, the information that we're putting in there, and I know writing textbooks myself, teaching classes, the students are like, do I have to read those pages? Is the information all important? And these elements that we've put a lot of time and effort and thought into the pedagogical approach that these extra pieces on the page have, oftentimes get ignored if they even open the book in the first place. So, we don't want to put more in there than needs to be. We want to put stuff that has a significance, that has an importance and a value to it at the point that it's placed on the page. So, how does that particular image, whatever it be, relate to the content that's on the page? And has it been placed on the page where it's appropriate so that there is a clear connection between the image and what's there on the page? Now, as Becky mentioned in my introduction, I've written and worked in web design elements for a long time. And each of those images that's put on a web page, we find an awful lot that are kind of useless fluff. But as I've taught web design practices and I've talked to students about choosing images for pages, I tell them we don't need to fill the space. Choose things that are appropriate. Find things that convey the meaning of what's on the page. And, that might require you to take a picture. You might not have one readily available. It might, in some cases, have you decide one doesn't need to be there and the content stands on its own. Whatever pictures you do choose, you want to make sure that they're of high quality and that they're clear. Clear both in, particularly for those of us that are producing textbooks and the pictures are coming out on a printed page. You want to have something that is a high resolution image, something that's 300 dots per inch or better in terms of the printing quality. And you've probably been asked for images of that level from your publishers at different points. But you want a physical high quality to the file that you're using so that when it's printed, it's physically clear, it's represented without fuzziness, and it's easy to understand what that picture was and why it's there, but that clarity of meaning again as well. So where we've taken the time to appropriately choose pictures, the reason for that picture or figure or element of visual nature on the page should be clear to the reader. It shouldn't just be window dressing. It shouldn't just be filler. It should, send a message that speaks those words that maybe we didn't have the word count available to put on the page. Now, a way to add to that clarity is add a figure caption. Give a succinct description. Help understand why that picture is there, what that picture represents, and speak to the audience. It's an additional place for understanding, and we want to take that 1,000 words and put it down into maybe 5 or 10 that appear with the picture, that echo the message that's being presented in the rest of the narrative on the page, but help to clarify the information that the picture is demonstrating, which requires us to effectively place it in relation to the content. If this is somewhere else on the document, maybe on the next page even, it loses its meaning by the time that we've turned the page, because what we were talking about, that this image was intentionally selected to be part of our manuscript, is no longer in the focus of the reader. So we want to be very cautious, particularly in the editing phases, that this figure that goes with this paragraph didn't end up 2 pages away from the paragraph that it supported. Now, in some cases, I know, particularly for those academic writers submitting to journals, oftentimes we don't have the luxury of putting the figures in the article where we want them. So that means we need to be diligent in identifying our figures, numbering the figures and placing them in an appendix. And then as we are speaking or, providing the text in the manuscript for that figure, that we reference it appropriately. And we say in figure 1, in figure 10. And now that figure can be accessed at the end in the appendix and be related in context with where it was chosen. So let's look at these 2 images. We've got the one on the left, we've got the one on the right. Both of these images I found by searching for research. But research might be a good key phrase for us to use here. So, if you had the choice of these 2 images, the one on the right is most definitely a higher quality image. Okay, it's clearly indicating a survey instrument. The one on the left is a little fun, but it's kind of cartoony. Our clip art mentality, that we can access. And by the way, I accessed both of these through Microsoft PowerPoint directly through the image search feature. Both of them are available and licensed under Creative Commons, and you can see the attributions underneath of the images there. So we have a wealth of image choices available to us based off of the internet, based off of Creative Commons licensing options. So, if I had the choice of putting these 2 into my document, they're going to convey different messages. They're going to convey different messages not only on the subject matter, but on my role as a researcher, my role as an author, is going to, in my opinion, be elevated a little bit if I have something that looks like a professional artwork or a professional image of higher quality, and that I've taken the time to find something that relates to the information that's there, versus a piece of clip art that, for all intents and purposes, may simply be filling white space. So if I'm choosing, I'm definitely choosing the one on the right here. Now, most of our figures will either be pictures that we have taken of the research, of the process. If we're incorporating pictures, we are likely not searching necessarily for them to end up in the situation of that previous slide. Or if we are, again, we're going to talk a little later about some sources where you can get some higher quality images for use, particularly those of you writing textbooks. I know on the most recent book that I wrote, finding stock art and using that as opposed to trying to take my own pictures, is most definitely a time saver in the overall process and a cost saver from having other people do that work or provide the images from the publisher perspective. But as far as any type of research and information, tables can be overwhelming. They can, the larger the data set, the more effective tables become, but then the more overwhelming that abundance of information can also become. So charts help us to summarize that and summarize it in a way that, again, that picture is sharing all of that information a little more efficiently. So when we're using charts, we want to think about that accuracy. We want to make sure that the chart is showing the user what the data said and doing so in an accurate way. And there's an awful lot of misleading charts out there. So as I get to a couple examples here, we'll talk about why some elements are possibly better choices to make sure that that accuracy is in there, which comes also into selecting the appropriate chart type. There's a variety, I think in the latest edition of Excel, I think there's over 20 different foundational chart types, and then a number of variations to each one of those. So there's a vast variety of ways that we can visualize data with charts. So then it becomes important that we select something that's going to accurately represent that data set through an appropriate type. Once we have the data in there, that's not good enough, though. As was seen, without labeling the information, even in the table itself with column or row headers, key values in a chart do not stand out unless there's some way to identify what those values are and what that information means. Now, again, in tables, we have the row and column headings. In charts, we have legends, we have data labels, we have other ways to identify key values in what's otherwise a picture. But in order to really see those values of importance, we have to minimize the clutter. We can't simply throw every bit of information that will be in a table into a chart. The chart is there to summarize, to synthesize, to bring that together into something that can clearly represent the data without all the noise that needs to be filtered through. So the chart should ultimately be able to stand on its own. Now, many times, charts are connected to a data set, and that data set and the chart are presented together. But even if you've sat on a committee or a board for an institution, you have probably flipped and looked at the charts and then possibly looked at the underlying data a little more to gain insight into the information that was presented. But we trust the accuracy of those charts most often, and we say, okay, well, I can see that this particular part is much larger than these other parts, so that's performing better. Or this part is much larger than these other parts, and we're spending an awful lot of money there, so maybe that's an area that we can look at to trim some. So we take that visual from the chart to make interpretations and assumptions of the underlying data, and then we have that data to come back to. But particularly with something like a PowerPoint presentation, the space to represent all of the data in a table versus representing it in a chart, the chart becomes a more efficient tool for the sake of the space that's allowed on the slide. So let's look at a couple charts here. We have on the left and on the right what are seemingly similar charts, and I'll tell you that the data is identical in both of these. The one on the left has a legend that identifies a blue bar of total sales and an orange bar of average product price, and has a title of sales and product price by region. And on the right, it's total sales with just blue bars. So the one on the left, I incorporated the data that I showed you earlier that was cleaned up in our table, north, northeast, east, south, and southwest regions. And you can see the extra space that's between those bars. Okay. If you remember from that table earlier, average product prices got up into the $20 range, somewhere between $20 and $30, okay? And none of them breached that $30 mark. Now look at the scale on the left-hand side here. We're talking about total sales of products by region. So we have grid lines, major grid line divisions, at every $200,000. Okay? Those orange bars don't even show up. To look at it, you might see a faint orange line there to the right of the blue column. There's definitely the space provided for it, and I can tell you that they are there if we zoomed far enough in, or I brought my grid lines down to $10 increments. Then it would just be a lot of $10 increments to get us up there to that 1.4 million level to cover the total sales for the Southwest. So in this case, because of the ranges of values given to the average product price and the total sales, this is ineffective to add that additional column worth of data into the chart. People are looking and saying something's missing, and hopefully you saw that as well. Whereas when we simplify it and say, for sake of scale, we only have total sales being represented by this chart. And if I'm interested in average product price, then I can either look at that on a different chart, or there is more advanced options in Microsoft Office to create what are called combination charts, where I can add a secondary axis on the other side with a completely different scale for the sake of graphing the average product price on the same chart area. Okay. Well, let's think about total sales, and let's think about the information that we want to see. And here we have a column chart on the left, and by the way, this is exactly the same column chart that was letter B on the previous slide, so I haven't done any magic here. And for sake of comparison of chart types, wanted to just move that forward. So as we move forward through these examples, there is a consistency to the data set. Okay. On the left is a column chart. I intentionally didn't add data labels. I find that data labels, particularly of the number of place values associated with these dollar amounts, become clutter on a chart, particularly on a column chart. Now, if this were a bar chart and turned horizontally, they can nicely be placed at the end or even along the bar without too much noise added to the chart. But from the vertical columns, there's only so much space width-wise that those columns are granted in the chart area. So, the extra labels become difficult to work with. Now, we also may be interested in contribution. So we may be looking at, how much did the East region produce in relation to the whole? And that's where a pie chart becomes effective. A pie chart shows us for a single value the various contributions, making the slices of the pie the part at a percentage appropriate to that particular value in the overall data set. So no matter whether you have 5 slices or you have 205 slices, although again, from a clarity perspective, 205 slices is an awful lot of slivers to try to get to in terms of your pie chart. The fewer lends nicely to a legend. So now we have colors representing each of our 5 regions. And we can see the contributions from a visual perspective. Now, this is a 2D pie, and this is a flat 2D pie with data labels added, with a legend, and the numbers are strictly there to identify what the actual dollar amount is associated with each one of those slices. And you may say, well, Eric, that's kind of boring. It doesn't look very pretty. It might look prettier than the column chart on the left. So we're looking at, again, the effectiveness. We're considering, how pretty does it have to be versus, is it conveying the right information to the reader? So same pie chart moved over here to A now. You might be a fan of our nice styled 3D pie charts. And over here on the right, we have a 3D pie chart that definitely looks prettier than the one on the left. It's got, even color-coded data labels that have combined the region with the dollar amount, so we're getting a nice visual effect from that perspective. But here's the problem with 3D pie charts. 3D pie charts give an illusion of greater value to the pieces that are closest to you. So what I mean by that is the bottom half of the pie chart, visually looking at that image on the right, the $678,000 worth of total sales for the South region, represented by that yellow slice, looks as big, if not bigger, because of that third dimension, than the North region, the darker blue in the top right corner, that has an actual value almost $200,000 more at $872,226. So we want to be really cautious about how this information is presented and the sequence that we go through for that information to visually be accurate to the recipient. So maybe we split the difference. In this last one here, we have the accuracy of a two-dimension pie chart on the right with the color coding and the lack of legend, but instead incorporating the regions into the actual areas. And I didn't do anything in terms of accessibility and trying to find colors that fit. I accepted the default options, from Microsoft when they created these charts for me. But the creation is really a matter of selecting the chart type. So one of my recommendations here is use 2 dimensions rather than 3 dimensions where possible to give the greater accuracy. It also helps improve in terms of any shading, color blindness issues, etc., for contrast purposes. So I'm hoping that the palettes that would kind of default here conform to accessibility guidelines, but those would be things that you might want to test and verify or make adjustments to from each of those slices. But now we've kind of found from our original starting point, let me go back a couple slides there, of a column chart where they're all the same colors, to a 2D pie chart with black lettering and a legend representing the colors of the slices, to that 3D that was almost too far because of the lack of accuracy, back to something that is 2-dimensional but incorporates the colors into the values so that there's a quick association to the slices and those data labels being pulled out of the pie, again, to kind of reduce some of the noise there. Okay. So as we work with figures, again, key is to make sure that we have accuracy of information and that the data is formatted in a way that clearly identifies key values, minimizes clutter, and particularly with charts that they can stand on their own. Even without going back to that original table, I can identify the total sales values by region for the information that's being presented. Okay, so there's a lot of technology that's available to us to make this a little easier. So, again, I've mentioned that these charts and tables I created using Microsoft PowerPoint, Excel. I went into for some of the charting just because PowerPoint actually leans on Excel to make that happen as it is. So, from a do-it-yourself perspective, there are common tools for creating and editing visual elements on your computer, one of which being Microsoft Office. So, at the back end, Office is the system, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, even Outlook, Access, have the ability to gain connection through Excel running on the back end to produce consistent chart after chart after chart. And if you copy and paste that into another application, it will either automatically link back to the source data or you can paste it as a picture. So, depending on your needs, moving forward, whether you need that information to maintain a live nature to it, where you would want to maintain that link to the original data set, or you actually want to just put it there for the visual aspect that is appropriate, which in a printed manuscript or something that we submit as a journal article or textbook definitely would be the case there. Now, if you want to get a little more professional in your design and you have the time and skills and artistic abilities, Adobe Creative Suite, Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign, etc. for making visuals. I use it a little bit. I am by no means a master at Adobe. I have definitely used it over the course of my time in terms of web design, but I am far more a programmer than the artistic side of things. So I rely on other tools. I rely on things like Canva, at canva.com for developing imagery, or Pictochart, or Stencil is actually the one that I use most frequently, at getstencil.com. Stencil.com is something different, but getstencil.com. All of these have got libraries of high quality images that are already licensed for use, that then you can incorporate your text, or you can mix and match images into a resulting figure that represents what you are trying to add as value to your manuscript. So taking a little bit of extra time to learn one or more of these tools now has enhanced your writing, enhanced the results that are being presented of the data and the information that you're trying to share with people. Eliminate some of the white space, eliminate some of the overwhelm from large narrative structures, and gives you something that at low or even potentially no cost on some of these can get you those one-off needs for presentations and manuscripts. Now then, there are stock images. So again, a lot of these are incorporated into those tools. And even the imagery that I talked about earlier that I found by searching in PowerPoint for research and using the online pictures tool that's built right into Microsoft Office. You can find high quality royalty-free image options, or ones that are licensed through Creative Commons and have the opportunity to reuse and share as long as you're given appropriate attribution. Some of the bigger ones that are used out there, Shutterstock or iStock Photo. Pexels is one that I've heard mentioned a number of different times, and I've browsed their catalog a couple times. I can't say that I've personally used them. Storyblocks I've been using since they were under another name, which is escaping me right now, but it doesn't matter. It's now Storyblocks for images. They actually also have video and audio. So for any of you that might be doing ebooks or creating your manuscripts for use in interactive systems, something to that regard may go beyond the images. And they do have annual subscriptions or the pay per image use structure in these types of tools there. And then Unsplash as an additional option at unsplash.com for royalty-free images. Which brings me to my last main topic here before we close out and bring this together so you can have some time for questions. Accessibility. Your visual components need to be accessible to all readers. So quite honestly, from an accessibility perspective, straight text is our safest option. But straight text is not as exciting, not as engaging, not as effective as incorporating visual elements. So what we want to make sure we do is we consider what's important when we're designing visual elements. So we do need to consider people who have visual impairments. We need to, whether that is a print file, or an ebook, we want to consider things like contrast, things, like labeling, things like captions. We want to make sure that the visual impairments are handled, including color blindness. So there are a variety of color blindnesses. And some people can't see reds, some people can't see greens, some people can't see color at all. So the varieties there, there are tools. VisiCheck, I think, is one. But there are a number of tools, and we've had webinars and articles specifically tailored to accessibility guidelines that I would encourage you to check out. That look at how does this appear to people with different levels of color blindness. And if you find that beautiful chart that you put together that looks great because of all the colors that you picked and all the labels and structure that you put in place, looks great on your page. But if you were seeing it through the perspective of someone who is completely colorblind, there's no way to distinguish slice 1 from slice 2. You need to rethink that chart before incorporating it into your final manuscript. Also think, particularly from the perspective of tables and figures, from the table title and the figure caption to summaries that are incorporated to the way that you designate header rows and columns within your software, that if I'm using a screen reader to read me your ebook, do I get the same message that was intended? And again, the sorting and the grouping and the classifications with headers that I was mentioning earlier all lend to a functionality of these tools to perform at their highest capability. Now, the intent was not in this program to go into all the accessibility options, and I know I wouldn't do it nearly as justice as what other webinars have done, but start at section 508.gov. Start at that website, whether it is documents or PDFs or websites or video or audio, whatever it is that you are doing, that you are creating for someone else's consumption. Consider accessibility and consider it from the start on what you're doing. Simple things like adding alt tags to images on web pages, or incorporating captions and summaries, or some of the metadata that goes into the document structure can greatly improve the effectiveness of the assistive technology that's on the market to help people gain access to the information that you're putting out into the world. So section 508.gov/create, again, it's categorized, and you can see the test in the navigation there where they have other tools and links to resources that can greatly help you make sure that you're doing the right thing in what you're putting out there so that you have the largest opportunity for consumption of your knowledge. So the big picture is, do your visuals convey the intended message? And a while back, I wrote a blog post for TAA on 7 tips for effective tables and figures that seemed like a appropriate way to kind of summarize the ideas presented in this webinar. We want to use the visuals that enhance the manuscript. If it can be done in a sentence or 2, it doesn't need a visual. So understanding as well that sometimes visuals are not the correct tool for the delivery of the information. But if they are there, make sure that they enhance, they don't simply duplicate the information that's being presented. We also want those visuals to stand in isolation. In the situation where the journal prints the figures and or the tables at the end in an appendix, as opposed to directly in line with the content, which we have the luxury of in most textbooks, you want to make sure that those images and those tables can be understood by themselves if necessary. And you want to reference them if they are placed somewhere other than immediately on the page. But even if they are on the page, provide reference where possible. Choose between tables and figures. You probably don't need both. Okay. Now, sometimes a data table can be helpful in supporting that chart, especially if that became the main source for the chart. But if you can describe the chart and the chart can stand without the table, so be it, and let it. Title tables, caption figures. Incorporate that if for no other reason, for someone to gain an understanding of what your intended message was by including that visual on the page. Organize the results Okay, so this comes into our column headings, our row headings, titles, level of precision, grouping and sorting, particularly with the sake of tables. And as far as figures, consider what information is around that picture on the page and what that is sharing with the reader at the time. Minimize the clutter. Okay, so data labels or legends, not necessarily both. And I showed you examples of both. And different times will call for different purposes. Remove backgrounds, or at least make them, plain. Don't opt for decorative backgrounds that distract the user from what the image is intending to convey. Even in terms of tables, minimizing the grid lines. The vertical grid lines are not necessary most of the time when you're shading across. We can then kind of quickly glance up and see the column headers and make sense of things without having all of those extra lines on the page. Minimize your precision levels. If you can get away with 1 decimal point, don't include 5 just because. Consider what your audience needs to understand, and then perhaps in additional references and resources, share that extra precision if needed. And avoid redundancy with the narrative. Make sure that your words on the page are speaking for themselves, the images are speaking for themselves, and that the two work together to present the entire message that you're trying to share. And then last but certainly not least, consider the accessibility factors that we've discussed to make sure that the assistive technology in place for people who need it is as effective as it's intended to be. So that's what I've got for you today. Looks like we do still have a few minutes left in the hour. So Becky, I'm going to hand it back over to you in case there are any questions.
Yes, thank you, Eric, for that excellent advice on adding visual elements to your textbook. We will now take time for questions.
The first question reads, great information, Eric. Is there any certain placement on the page that is preferred for images? If it is a large image and can fit to the side, is it better for it to appear above or below a text, below the text associated?
Honestly, I think that becomes a matter of preference. For my preference, when it's a larger image that's related to the text, I like to introduce it in the narrative and then present the image to support what I have said. And use a figure caption that kind of summarizes the picture, but at the same time summarizes the narrative that I've already given. So I like the picture to be below the narrative in that case. If it's too large to kind of set in line to the right or to the left. And that said, my preference is also, where possible, to set images to the right. So that there's kind of this natural flow to read the narrative that it's associated with and then digest the imagery as support to the message that was conveyed in the narrative.
All right, thank you, Eric. So it looks like there was another question. Oh, there it comes. 1 second. All right, then the next one reads, thanks for this, Eric. For print book article writers should check to see whether they accept color or only grayscale. Any suggestions for making color readable in black and white?
So, definitely when you choose colors initially that have contrast to them, that, particularly our chart examples, if you run them through something like Visitech and you explore that from the perspective of, how will this appear to someone who can't see color at all? That gives you a real good idea of how it's going to, come out from a perspective of grayscale. But high contrast in terms of your color palettes should ensure differences when it is printed without color. It is something that if you know ahead of time that you can prepare for, If you're using something like the Adobe tools, then you can quickly change from RGB or CMYK as color palette structures to a black and white or grayscale format, so that you're submitting something and not simply letting post-production take over and perhaps destroy the imagery that you had intended. So if you knew in advance that these particular manuscripts are going to not incorporate color in the printing process, then I would suggest submitting the imagery in black and white or grayscale to start with, just for level of accuracy. But if you have the color option in other places, to use the accessibility tools to test for what this looks like, and the contrast levels first, before submission, is just going to give you a better overall finished result.
Great, thank you, Eric. Looks like there's just one more question here. He's asking if you could please show the slides of the photo and visual elements resources again. You could just go back to that slide.
Animations always make it. Are we looking here for the royalty-free options or the slide before this?
Well, he didn't specify, but so we can just keep this one on here for a second. And then if you just want to show the other one really quick for just another second too. And I do have one other comment here. She says another is Pixabay for free and royalty-free images.
That's a good one as well. There are thousands of them out there now. I was trying to rack my brain to come up with some of the ones that I knew I had used or seemed to be commonly used, but Pixabay is another one. Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm. Again, thank you, Eric, for sharing your expertise with us, and thank you all for participating in today's presentation.
And thank you, Becky.